Luke Thomas here of MMAfighting.com, joined on the line by, I guess, former UFC middleweight contender, now UFC light heavyweight contender, host of UFC Tonight, coach on the current season Ultimate Fighter, and a whole lot of hats he wears, the one and only Chael Sonnen. Chael, how are you?
I am doing well, thanks, Luke.
Okay, so there's a basic question that I want to answer, but I'm going to ask the question at the end, which is, what makes good MMA wrestling? So don't answer that just yet, but I want you to think about that. We'll get into sort of bits and pieces ahead of time. Okay.
Cool.
All right. So the first thing on my mind is, why is there a loose connection between the level of wrestling somebody comes from and their level of achievement with the use of their wrestling in MMA? So, for example, you'll see some guys who are Olympians or Olympic alternates whose MMA wrestling is and then you'll see some of these guys who come from D2 programs and they'll beat the brakes off of you. So, what is your sense about why that happens?
Well, there's a tremendous misunderstanding amongst exclusive MMA fans as to what wrestling is. And one element of wrestling that I know when I grew up with, we put a lot of emphasis towards was the takedown. But you could win an Olympic championship and never score a takedown. And I don't know if MMA fans are even aware of that. You could win an NCAA championship and never score a takedown. And that's actually quite common. To literally never score one is possible. To literally never score one doesn't happen all that often. But to not put an emphasis on it is very common. So the point that I'm getting at is, a guy could be a fantastic wrestler on the wrestling mat and come in with a lot of credentials. In fact, there's a Cuban fighter right now named Yoel Romero, who for my time is as good of any wrestler that ever lived during that generation, during the Chael Sanderson, Les Gutches, Yoel Romero phase. But he didn't score a lot of points with takedowns. He scored his points with tilts and turns and defensive techniques on top. So when it gets into an MMA situation, it doesn't mean he's going to be able to get on top. And that's really misunderstood by a lot of people.
So that leads to my second question, which is basically about what is valuable in MMA, right? So if you listen to Hodger Gracie, he'll tell you a lot of this BJJ stuff, sport BJJ, it's kind of worthless. Like for a true spider guard, you need to be able to grip the gi. There goes that. For X guard, you're going to get pounded on by anybody who's got good balance and is on top. So how much of wrestling, pure wrestling, is worthless for MMA contexts?
I would say you can only use a couple of the techniques. I would say it's as few as two. Now there's variations off of that, but those become MMA. Here's what you want to do in any sport. You want to find out what's illegal. And whatever is illegal is what you want to do in MMA. And a perfect example would be dirty boxing. The reason you can't grab a guy around the collar of his neck and start punching him with your free hand in a boxing match is because it's so effective that they had to make it illegal. Wrestling is the same way a lot with our locks. There's times in wrestling we are not allowed to lock our hands together. The reason is if we locked our hands, the other guy would never get away, and it would just be a battle of who could ever get to that lock first would win. So those things, you want to find out what's illegal, and you quickly want to start implementing them if they are legal in a sanctioned MMA fight, because it's what's most effective. In Greco-Roman wrestling, which is what I did, we're not allowed to block with our head. If the gentleman is to put his head on you, it shuts down all of your offense. So they just made it illegal to do. I know I fought a guy named Michael Bisping, couldn't wrestle a lick, but he put that head where I grew up my entire life that being illegal to do, and it completely shut me down for an entire round until I could figure it out. So I hope I'm answering your question. I've brought in all sorts of sports, but the main thing is, you bring up Hodger Gracie's comment, and yeah, he's probably the most fantastic and intimidating submission guy in the UFC right now, or in MMA. He hasn't made his debut yet. But if I could take two more elements away, it would shut him down completely. He loves to go on a guy's back and he'll choke you out. If you took that away, it would really limit him. But the great fighters are only good at one or two things.
So what is hugely valuable?
For a wrestling technique, if you could get to the body, meaning you get in underhook position, you can get your hands locked and get control of his body. that would be the number one thing, or if you could get control of his head. And when I say body, of course, that would also go down to his hips, like what people call a double leg situation. Double leg in MMA is completely different than what you would do in wrestling because the posture is different. You're standing upright as opposed to bent over. You're slipping a punch as opposed to grabbing a guy's elbow and doing a traditional elbow pull or a slide by in wrestling. So there's only a couple of things in wrestling that really work. The wrestling or wrestlers tend to do good in MMA because they tend to just be some tough guys. It's not a karate situation where they grew up their whole life punching the air. In a wrestling situation, you grab a hold of another human being every day, and they're just, they get in good shape and they're rough and they're used to going a long time and going when they're hurt and tired and all of that good stuff. But wrestlers don't do well because wrestling technique is superior to another discipline's technique.
Well, I'm sort of curious about it. If I looked at the state, I'm just I've wrestled a little bit, but I'm terrible at it. I'm just a hobbyist, so I'm speaking from a very amateurist position. But from my vantage point, it looks to me like the state of MMA wrestling is similar to the state of jiu-jitsu in MMA, which is to say guys are much better at defense than they are offense. Like, people always say George St. Pierre is this amazing MMA wrestler, but he's one of the few guys out there who's executing takedowns. Most of the time when you think of good MMA wrestlers, you think of guys like Jose Aldo, who just limp legs and gets out of single leg and double leg attempts. Would you agree with that characterization?
Well, the first thing I'm going to disagree with is how you humbly opened your question. I would like to state for all of your listeners that Luke Thomas is possibly the single greatest mind I've ever had the pleasure to work with in understanding all aspects of MMA, and he often likes to beat himself up at times, but don't fall for it. The guy's a genius. Secondly, yes, George St. Pierre has one wrestling technique. George St. Pierre could never push and pull and pummel and set a guy up. He has one technique, which is the double leg. Now, off of that double leg, he's got about 3 different setups he uses to get to that position, and he's got about 6 different finishes, depending on what his opponent does when he gets there. So no, George is, I would call him the best wrestler in MMA, but I would also go out and go, George knows extremely little about wrestling. If you want to go into a wrestling match, George is not the guy you want to coach and train you. But he has learned and perfected one position. He's done, again, he does about 3 setups and 5 finishes. And, he's phenomenal. I watch him run over guys like Josh Koscheck, and I can just hardly even believe what I'm seeing. But again, it's just one position. But I would like to remind you, the really good ones, the greats, only have 1 or 2 things that they do well. Mike Tyson only had an uppercut, but the greats only need 1 or 2 tools.
But would you agree, though, that more guys, like if you look around and guys are training their MMA wrestling, they're getting better at stopping a takedown versus executing one? Would you agree with that?
100%, absolutely. And the reason is in wrestling, if I go into a wrestling practice, and I go to wrestling practice all the time, I go wrestle with our local college, but I'm going to hit 100 different moves. It's just part of a wrestling day. You're going to grab this position, then you're going to work out of this position, and this. You're going to hit about 100 different moves. In MMA, there's only 1 or 2 that work. So from a defensive posture, you don't have to learn wrestling to stop wrestling. You only have to learn, a quick brawl to stop a double leg. And maybe something else. Everything else gets thrown out, a lot like what Hodger said.
So is there a good base for it? And here's what I mean. Like Cejudo, and Henry Cejudo is going to make his way into MMA, and mentally we'll see where he is. But if you ask like scouts to look at the way he wrestles, they're like, he's athletic, he's quick, he has great motion, high amplitude throws. Do those things in your mind, watching that, correspond with success at MMA?
Very little of that will. What will work with Henry, if Henry Cejudo was a stock, I would invest heavily in the stock. His work ethic, his competitive ability, his gamesmanship, his control of the mat, those are things that'll work. But no, you're not going to see very many of those techniques. Here, let me give you a perfect example. In this country, the Greco-Roman wrestlers are usually the freestyle rejects. The guys that couldn't make it in freestyle went over and did Greco-Roman. Now, I am a Greco-Roman guy, so I can tell you firsthand that really is true. However, with the freestylers being the better athletes and having the far superior or far greater techniques, numbers-wise, Greco-Roman wrestlers have always done better than in MMA. You know, from Randy Couture to Dan Henderson, Matt Lindland, myself, we've always done better than the freestyle guys, and none of us can figure out why. I argue that it's largely due to the posture. When you bring up Henry Cejudo, he is in a bent-over situation. He's bent at the waist and back. He's keeping his head low to the mat. In a Greco-Roman situation, you're standing straight up and down, which is the same posture as you use in an MMA or a boxing situation. It's straight up and down. And a lot of the freestyle guys are really having a hard time getting their attacks off and getting to the legs or to the hips because they're so used to doing it crouched over as opposed to standing upright, which is what you're forced to do in the octagon.
So what does that say, though? I mean, let's say these guys could take a punch. What does that portend for somebody like Jordan Burrows or even, the Mr. Ankle Pick himself, Chael Sanderson?
Yeah, well, and again, Chael would never hit an ankle pick in MMA. It just wouldn't work. If that shoe isn't there to grab, it's not going to work. He's going to slip. He's just going to slip right off of a guy's slippery ankle. You bring up the ankle pick, it just makes me go right back to Yoel Romero, who a lot of your listeners aren't going to know who he is, but I'm a bit of a fan.
He fought in
because again, he was from my day.
He also fought in Strikeforce. He lost to Fejal Cavalcanti.
He lost to Fejal. In fact, yeah, that was the fight where Fejal ended up getting into some red tape with the commission. But Yoel did get brought over. Even though he lost, he's 0-1 in Strikeforce. They did bring him to the UFC. He's got his debut coming up. But the point is, yes, those techniques would not work. And even Jordan Burroughs' double leg, would a double leg work in MMA? Of course. It's probably the most effective high percentage takedown in MMA. But his setups aren't going to work. He's not going to be bent over. He's not hitting arm drags. He's not going to drop to both knees on the mat and then come springing off the mat. He's going to have to do it from an upright position. All of Jordan Burroughs' double legs start with his head underneath your head and then him driving in an upward motion. He would have to adapt to where his head is upright and he now needs to go down to get to the double leg. Could he do that? Yeah, he could probably do that in a matter of months. But it's still going to change. It's not going to be the same thing. And the same with Chael. Chael's biggest scoring techniques would not work in the octagon. However, I don't think any of us are going to doubt that Chael will find a way to drag somebody down inside of the ring.
All right, so just to be clear, you're absolutely of the mind, because I speak to some wrestlers and they tell me, hey, listen, people say the double leg is higher percentage than, a single leg sweep, but that's not true because it's really a function of the wrestler using it. But it seems to me a double leg is a more accessible tool to all levels of wrestling. I mean, yeah, Jordan Burroughs' double is going to be a lot better than your average guy at some MMA gym, but they do work more often. Do you agree?
Oh, absolutely. I absolutely agree. I don't believe the single leg exists in MMA. Whenever I teach it, I give a guy my leg. I get all my guys around. They're sitting down. They're watching me in the middle show technique. I give a guy my leg, and I ask the group, does this guy have my leg? And they all say yes. And I say, well, look again. Does he have my leg? And they say yes. I say, look again. Does he have my leg, or do I have both of his hands? And then that's where people start to understand a single leg, you don't want a single leg. I'd gladly start a fight allowing the guy to have a single.
Okay, so is that why we don't see like treetop takedowns or, I guess only time I can remember that is Rich Crunkleton in the WEC, but generally you don't see them, or, guys run the pipe, but they get punched in the face, so they switch to the double off the fence. Is the single leg just not effective for MMA purposes, generally speaking?
It truly is not, and that doesn't mean you're not going to see a guy grab a single and fall down. I know Okami did a couple real sloppy ones, and surprisingly, Hector fell right down over the weekend. But yeah, they really aren't. I know Randy Couture loved to go to a one-leg takedown when he was at heavyweight. He would come way up as high as you could possibly get in the groin and lift the guy straight up and put him down using his head as a lever. That kind of worked, but I think largely he was forced to do that because those heavyweights were so big he just couldn't get his arms wrapped around them. But yeah, you're really not going to see them. You're just not. A guy can hop on one leg. If you get a hold of both legs, there's nothing to hop, especially if you pick him up off the mat. It's just simple physics with gravity.
So, who would you say is, for example, Chris Honeycutt came out of Edinburgh, I
Oh
believe,
yeah, Edinburgh. Yep, he's at
and
AKA now.
and he was recruited, right? I mean, people saw what he was doing in D1. They said, okay, he didn't win a title necessarily, but we want to get a hold of this guy. Obviously, he'd expressed interest, but I think people or camps now are better at taking those guys and more quickly transitioning them to the higher levels of MMA. Who would you say, when you look around the landscape, is doing that well, and then why?
Well, I wasn't sure if your question was what athlete is doing that well or what programs are good at recruiting, but the recruiting is really going, for wrestlers at least, to the AKA. They've got Dan Cormier, who's one of the most respected wrestlers of recent memory, not only as a competitor but as a coach. Mo Lawal, they've got Kane, of course, out there, John Fitch, they had Koscheck for a while. These were all very good wrestlers, so it was pretty easy to start attracting other good wrestlers. But there are a lot of guys, and they aren't necessarily the champions in wrestling, that I think would transition to MMA wrestlers a lot quicker and better. Again, for the listeners, you can win a national championship in wrestling without scoring a takedown. And though that doesn't literally happen very often, it comes very close. There's a number of guys that will get one takedown a match, but then get on top and score a plethora of points to advance to the next round. And that just doesn't work in MMA. There's other guys that get takedowns, but it's all on the mat. They shoot, they stop on both knees, they get in a scramble situation, they come out on top. The kind of wrestler that's going to do well in a combat style event like MMA is one that can explode through, doesn't need to spend time on the mat, hit his opponent, get him off his feet, and get on top quickly.
And so that's why you believe Honeycutt could be, because he finishes takedowns with authority, and he's a big physical bruiser.
Yeah, he's a big, rough guy. I'm a believer in Honeycutt. I was pretty excited when he came to MMA. I was hoping to get him up here in Portland, but they scooped him up, and yeah, I think he's going to do well. He is a bruiser, like you said. He's a big physical guy. He dives in there for a takedown. The other thing, Luke, that's important is when you get on top. One of the reasons we haven't seen foreign wrestlers do very well. And there's been champions, again, Yoel Romero, for my once again to go back to him, but there's been a number of other guys that have come over. And the reason, Vladimir Matyshenko is a great example. Can't wrestle a lick inside the octagon. He's one of the most decorated wrestlers the UFC has. And a lot of fans don't even know that. In America, you are awarded if you can keep an opponent down. In America, you are rewarded if you can get up off of the bottom. So in other countries, when a takedown happens, there is no effort to stand up and get away. There is also no effort to keep the guy down. If you're down and you stay there for about 15 seconds, the referee will force the top guy to let you up, and then the match continues on their feet. So a lot of these foreign guys, they don't know how to do it. They get a takedown, but if you're with a guy like me that's going to just scramble and pop right back up to his feet, all of a sudden you're exhausted, your takedown didn't benefit you anything because you didn't get to lay there and use it. Now we're back on your feet and you're tired. And that's a big problem for the foreign guys. The other thing is if we take a foreign guy down, we could keep him there all day because that's where we spend our whole life is holding a guy down. The foreign guys aren't used to standing up and getting away. So that's the reason, I'll see a lot of articles will come out of, if the Olympics get bashed, are the Russians going to come in? Are the Ukrainians? They can try, but the style of wrestling will not adapt.
You took the words out of my mouth.
They adapt.
I was actually going to ask about the Russians because everyone sort of says, listen, the Russian connection to MMA is through Sambo and to a much lesser extent Judo. They dominate in international wrestling, but you're sort of the mind that American folk style is clearly better suited, given the nature of MMA, for MMA, than the more common international freestyle.
Yeah, I certainly would. The international freestyle or even the international Greco-Roman, it's very, very limited on what would transfer over. And again, if you can't get up off the bottom, you're in really big trouble unless you're, again, some kind of like a Hodge or Gracie style where you don't mind being there. And the other thing is it's a lot of energy to use a takedown. If you go out and you fight hard for a takedown and the opponent pops back up, well, now your batteries run down, and here you are back in battle. In wrestling, you would usually get some time to work. You're just trained to have that breather. So it's a really big deal for foreign wrestlers, and we see it a lot. Tom Watson just beat a very good foreign wrestler, and he beat him to death, but it's the same deal. The guy, I can't think of his name. I think you know who I'm talking about. Thiago Silva tapped him out, and then Tom
Stanislav
Watson just
Nedkov.
beat him up. Yeah, and the guy's an excellent fighter, and he's an excellent wrestler, but they don't transfer. It's not the same thing.
So what do we even call MMA wrestling? And here's what I mean. Like, I was always told, I mean, listen, you see Daniel Cormier hitting inside trips, and you see occasionally guys catch a leg and kick out a post or something like that. But I was told generally that, trips are valuable, but if you see a guy who's overly reliant upon them, it probably means he's not the best wrestler. And then here we have Demian Maia, who has elevated trips. I mean, I don't know who doesn't get tripped when he gets a hold of him. What would you call that? An extension of his sort of like basic jiu-jitsu takedowns that he's elevated to high art, or is that also MMA wrestling?
I wouldn't call it MMA wrestling just because what Maya's doing would be illegal in wrestling, but that's back to my original point. Find out what's illegal and start doing it because they made it illegal because it's most effective. What Maya's doing is a combination, to me, of what we call backyard wrestling, where he's just out there going hard and making things work. And, of course, he's got some wrestling and some judo mixed in. I was the victim of that by Maya. I got against the fence. I'm in a position that I like. He steps across, and what we consider a bad technique in wrestling, throws me all through the air. I come crashing down to the mat thinking, what in the heck just happened? And how? How do I do that? That sure was a good move. So, it is a different deal. And what you said about Daniel Cormier, he's in a different weight class. Wait till he comes down. We don't have, he's able to do some stuff against heavyweights that will change in the light heavyweight division. And Daniel can scramble and hit some beautiful techniques, but he doesn't always have to. Lately, one technique, one score. Good wrestling will take 3 or 4. If I'm fighting a guy that can wrestle, my first attack isn't going to work. If my first attack works, well, then I'm fighting a guy that can't wrestle.
All right, just a couple of questions, and we'll let you go here. I spoke to Duke Rufus, and we were talking about turning Ben Askren into a better striker. And the sense I got from him, and he didn't say it exactly like this, but the sense that I got was that, listen, jabbing at range, it's pretty much just going to be all functional stuff for Ben Askren. But on the ground, he had some hope. He had some hope that he could really turn on the heat and start hurting guys with a ground and pound. And one of the arguments that he made was that it's a bit of a different muscle group for ground and pounding than it is for striking at distance. So taking that concept and then asking about wrestling, does pure wrestling ask athletically different things from competitors that MMA does? I mean, wrestling seems to be a bit of a sprint, then stop, then sprint, then stop. Whereas if you're a 25-minute fight, it's hard too, but it's almost like endurance training. Athletically, what are the differences?
I don't know that athletically there's a difference, but there is certainly different athletes. I've seen athletes do real well in wrestling that have that Ben Askren marathon-style pace, where they're going to start at one pace and just stay on you nonstop, whether it's Askren or Nick Diaz, that are just going to stay on you at the same pace. I also know some guys that go out there and sprint. They start at one pace, boom, and they explode. They get their points, they get on top, and now they go back and rest. They slow everything down, wait for the opponent to get away, boom, explode again. I think that's just an athlete. An athlete's just one way or the other. I don't think the sport makes them that way. But I would agree with what Coach Rufus said about Ben Askren. And when he gets a guy on the ground, it's very hard to get away. And he drains your battery so fast. The minute he gets his hands on you, you're starting to get tired. And he stays on you and he smothers you, and you just never get that range, that freedom to start your offense. So Ben Askren is going to be very effective. But yeah, I mean, you don't have to be an expert in the sport to see, boy, that guy sure needs to work on his hands and his kickboxing if he's going to go and compete at a high level like, say, the UFC.
Any predictions for what will probably be the 165-pound final between Kyle Dake and David Taylor?
I don't have a prediction. I as excited as I am for that match, as much as that match needs to happen for wrestling, I almost wish it didn't. Just because one of those guys has to come up short, and they're both champions. I just admire them both so much. I can't wait for the match. I tell you one thing, Luke, here's my prediction. You and I won't miss it.
That's true. Last question before we let you go. It's the whole theme of this whole thing. In the course of this conversation, talking about these things, if I asked you what makes great MMA wrestling, what would you say?
what would make great MMA wrestling is to understand what works. If you want to be a great wrestler, if you're a wrestler and you're coming over to MMA or vice versa, you're anything. You need to understand that most everything needs thrown out. Just like Hodger says, hey, submissions don't work in MMA, and then he goes and submits everybody. What Hodger's really trying to say is most submissions don't work, but there are still a few. So let's isolate what few ones we're going to use and practice them every day so that our offense of those and our execution is better than our opponent's defense of those. And so that's what I would say in wrestling. Don't be afraid to turn on your own discipline. Don't be afraid to go, hey, this wrestling stuff really doesn't work very well. But there are a couple of elements where I can drag a guy down to the ground.
All right, Chael Sonnen takes on John Jones, I guess, in April now. Best of luck to you then. Thank you so much for this talk. Really insightful. Let's do it again sometime soon.
I appreciate it. Thanks, sir.
Take care.